It's a pleasure to witness back on the witness stand. And Mr. McGee, you may cross the stand.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, Mr. Jones.
Good afternoon, sir.
Now, are you familiar with the American Academy of Forensic Sciences?
Yes, sir.
Are you a member?
No, sir, I'm not.
You attended some of their training?
I've been to a number of their seminars.
And what is the American Academy of Forensic Sciences?
It's a nationwide professional association for forensic scientists. It includes not only criminalistics, but other forensic like forensic medicine, forensic engineers. It's a wider scope than the California Association of Criminalists, which just involves criminalistics.
And as part of your training, I think you discussed you have to review journals and studies done in the field of DNA.
Yes, sir. Back in the when I was a qualified DNA analyst, I was required to review at least one article. I believe it was one article a year, and record that as part of almost like a continuing education request.
It was like a reading log you had to keep.
Yes, sir.
And that was part of the accreditation also for the lab as well, correct? That it's technicians actually kept up on their training?
The DNA analyst did. Yes, sir. I don't believe our technicians had that requirement.
Analyst is a better word.
Thank you.
Yes. And so are you familiar with the Journal of Forensic Science?
Yes, sir, I am.
And you were published in that journal, correct? Some time ago?
Quite some time ago. Yes, sir.
And would it be safe to say that it's a peer-review type journal?
A very highly respected peer-reviewed journal. Yes, sir. Within the field.
Would you call them a reliable authority within the DNA analyst field?
Within the field of criminalistics. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the Journal of Forensic Science International Genetics?
Yes, sir.
Would you feel that that is a reliable authority on DNA analysis in the field?
Yes, sir.
It's kind of the European version of the earlier journal you described?
I believe so. I'll be quite honest, I'm not sure exactly where all of these journals are published, but they are recognized as being a place where researchers or analysts can go to have articles written on either research that they've done or cases that they've experienced and so forth, or even comment on other people's articles. And it is as you mentioned, these are each peer-reviewed journals that are specific to our profession.
And it's also a place where you, if you do a trial study or a study, it's a place to post that as well?
Yes, sir.
Is it easy to get published in the journal?
If you do your work well, yes, sir. If you don't, they have a pretty good, basically a standard, a bar that they want you to meet in order to be able to maintain the quality of the articles that they publish.
So it's a screening process to make sure that the journal is continue to be respected by its readers.
I believe that's true, yes, sir.
They don't want junk papers in there that people say, this is nonsense, and stop reading the journal.
That would make sense, yes, sir.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine?
I believe I am, yes, sir. Now it's not as
Prominent?
in my mind, yes, sir.
But is it still a reliable authority on DNA analysis, studies, and peer review?
I believe it is.
How about the Australian Journal of Forensic Science?
Again, that's not one I am intimately familiar with. I don't know that I read more than one article from that particular journal.
Would you consider a reliable authority, though?
The one article I read seemed to have it was on a research study that was done. It seemed to have a systematic way that they went about doing their research and followed a proper scientific format. So I would accept it, if you will, but again, it's not one that I'm totally familiar with. I'm really familiar with the Journal of Forensic Sciences, Forensic Science International. There's another one I believe is called Science and Justice. It used to be called Journal of Forensic Science Journal. It was put out in Britain. Those are the ones that I have major interaction with in terms of reading their articles.
How about legal medicine?
I know it exists. I don't know that I may have read an article in there, but
You can't opine of whether or not it's reliable. Reliable authority for DNA information analysis.
what's the name of the journal again?
Legal medicine.
As I recall, that one is more for pathology. And so therefore, probably is good for their field.
Are you familiar with Elsevier? E-L-S-E-V-I-E-R. I think is the publisher of the Journal of Forensic Science International.
I recognize the name. That's about all I can tell you.
Like a little icon of a tree with the gold lettering down below. Does that sound familiar?
I just remembered the name. With regard to the icons, I can't say.
Now you said you at some point during your testimony. Well, strike that. Let's go back. You ever heard of Bodie Selmark?
Yes, sir.
And how do you know of Bodie Selmark?
They're a well-known private laboratory that does forensic casework.
And they do it for a lot of government agencies when local municipality can't afford a crime lab?
That's my understanding. I don't recall that I personally have interacted with them, but I know that a number of agencies have sent samples to them for analysis. They seem to be a well-respected laboratory.
I assume they're accredited as well?
That I don't know. I expect that they are, but I don't know.
You'd expect it if agencies are sending stuff to them.
It would be pretty much a requirement if you're sending evidence to them. You're really only supposed to send it to an accredited laboratory that is following either the quality assurance guidelines or some other similar guidelines, so that you can then accept the data back.
Now, San Bernardino Crime Lab, the DNA branch that you work with, that's accredited, correct?
The crime lab is, yes, sir.
And do you do work just for San Bernardino County, or do you do it for other counties or other parties in the region?
When I was employed there, we accepted cases from both San Bernardino and Riverside County agencies.
Do you know if Riverside County has developed their own DNA lab, or do they still use San Bernardino?
Since our taking on of some Riverside cases, the Riverside lab actually has developed a forensic DNA laboratory, and therefore Riverside County agencies really have the option then of sending it to the Riverside State Crime Lab or to the San Bernardino County Lab. We still have as far as I know, we still have the mechanism for them to submit cases to us.
And you said it's a state lab. Is it run in conjunction with the Department of Justice of California?
Exactly, yes, sir.
Now, sometime during your testimony, you mentioned RFU. I don't believe you defined what that is. Could you explain to the jury what an RFU is?
It's a relative fluorescence unit.
And that's like when we were seeing I call them E-grams, the I don't even remember.
Electropherograms.
That one.
Yes, sir.
When you have your peaks, and you have like the number for your threshold, is the number that you see is the RFU number.
That's correct. It is the height of the peak in the electropherogram represents the RFUs, or relative fluorescent units, for that particular allele.
Now, on direct, you kind of describe the analytical threshold. Is it safe to define it as the lowest RFU value that you can use to distinguish an allele from noise?
According to our validation and accepted protocols, yes, sir.
And you guys set that at 50.
That's correct.
But generally, that's what it is. It's kind of the floor for a lab to say, this, you shouldn't look at anything lower than what we're setting as the floor.
That's the definition of an analytical threshold. Yes, sir. Different labs may set it at different RFUs.
And I read things about its allele preservations maintained by the analytical threshold. Does that sound like something that makes sense to you?
Not at all.
Yeah, I was like, okay, maybe he can explain that. You talked about a low-level DNA sample. Could you define that for the jury as well? What you mean by that?
A low-level DNA sample would be a sample in which the RFU values that you get are very low or maybe just above the analytical threshold. As you saw, some of the peaks that we have, or maybe you saw, have RFU values, say 1100, relatively high. As the peaks get lower, it represents less and less DNA in the sample. So that when you get down to peaks that have values of 63 or 100, it's a very low level amount of DNA that is present there.
Are you familiar with the term stochastic threshold?
Yes, sir.
Could you explain to the jury what that is?
At a particular DNA location, if you have someone who had, I'll use the term heterozygote. Heterozygote means that they have two alleles at a particular DNA location. I spoke about that with that one display talking about the mother. She was a 10 and a 4. She is heterozygous at that location. If she were a 10 and a 10, she would be homozygous. So if a person is heterozygous at a particular DNA location, there's an expectation that both alleles should be represented evenly, or relatively evenly, in the electropherogram charts that we see. As the amount of DNA gets less and less and less, there comes a point at which they're not quite as equally amplified. And at some point, it may be that one is there prominently and the other one is not as prominent or not there at all. And that is called the stochastic level, the level at which you may detect one allele and not detect the second allele. It does not rise above the analytical threshold.
The stochastic threshold, that's always higher than the analytical threshold, correct?
Yes, sir.
So there's an area between the stochastic and analytical threshold.
Yes, sir.
And have you ever heard the term stochastic effects?
I may have heard it, I don't know if I've heard that particular term. Well, a stochastic effect would be one in which an allele perhaps is preferentially amplified over another allele to the point where you expected them to be of relatively equal strength. They are not.
I read that as a sister allele imbalance.
That'd be another term for it. Yes, sir.
How about allele drop-in? Is that an effect?
Allele drop-in is a different phenomenon. Really, when you talk about stochastic, there's the possibility of what's called allele drop-out, where the second allele or one of the alleles is not present anymore, is not detected. Allele drop-in is another problematic issue with low-level, extremely low-level DNA. And it could be that there is some sort of result that you get. It indicates the presence of an allele, and it's not really there. This generally happens when laboratories use extremely low analytical thresholds, much below the 50 that we use. Perhaps their analytical threshold is dropped down to 20 or 15. The instrument may call some of the peaks alleles, in essence, then they have appeared or they have dropped in, and they aren't really there.
Well, the instrument wouldn't even recognize it as an allele if it's below the analytical threshold, right?
That's true.
They only categorize them if they're above it.
That's true. In my answer, I was describing that the analytical threshold actually has been lowered. If someone lowers the analytical threshold, it is possible to lower it to a level where the instrument then will call something a peak, and it's not really there. It is, in essence, a allele drop in.
I kind of look at them as like a ghost allele, something that you see that's not really there.
Or a false allele.
What's an elevated stutter?
The electropherogram that we first looked at, the one of Mr. Merritt, had those two very tall peaks, and then the really small peaks that were one repeat unit smaller than that. I mentioned at the time it's an artifact of the process that we use. It's called stutter. The validation studies that we do take a look at samples and measure the percentage of stutter of the small peak in relation to the large peak. And we create filters where if a peak occurs in what's called a stutter position, it must rise above a certain percentage of the other peak in order to actually be called as an allele. There may be times where, for some reason, that particular peak does not get filtered out by the stutter filter, but is in fact stutter from that allele. In that instance, you have a case of what's called elevated stutter.
And if the stutter is above the analytical threshold, then that could affect the analysis once it's identified as a stutter. That you have to watch out for.
The stochastic effect is much more narrowly defined. The individual terms that you use all come together with regard to the interpretation guidelines that are set up by the validation studies for being able to interpret the data. And you need to be able to understand all of these phenomenon and use them when you develop your interpretation guidelines. In essence, you have to understand the limits of your test.
And wouldn't it be fair to say that the stochastic threshold is the point where you've determined in your validation studies that no stochastic effects, any of those four I described, never appear above that level?
No, sir. I think that you could have an allele that may exhibit an elevated stutter.
Yes.
And so therefore it's an allele that is above the stochastic thing. It may exhibit an elevated stutter. I would not include it in the term stochastic effect.
Well, the point of the threshold is trying to eliminate needing to look for those. It doesn't mean they don't happen, but you try and set your threshold to, you're safe to assume these are alleles without effect.
You set your analytical threshold, you set your stutter filter percentages, you set your, well, the stochastic threshold is really an interpretation threshold. It's not one that's necessarily set by the instrument. And the instrument really sets the stutter filter as well as the analytical threshold before it reports the potential of an allele or presence of an allele. It's the interpretation later on that incorporates the stochastic level as to whether you should have or should have not expected a sister or paired allele with an allele that was detected.
Is it safe to say if you set your analytical threshold or stochastic threshold too low, then you could impact your analysis with items that are not allele?
Not so much the stochastic, but definitely the analytical level.
And what's the stochastic threshold for San Bernardino?
Wow. I believe it was 142.5 RFUs, but it has been quite a while since I've had to use it in terms of interpretation. So, I realize I'm under oath, but don't quote me on that.
It's fair. Now, if you set your threshold too low, you could get junk in there that can affect your analysis.
The analytical threshold.
If you set it too high, then you also have the danger of loss of reliable information. Would that be fair?
You will be missing information. The information that you get will be reliable, but you won't get all of it if you set your analytical level too high.
Like if you set your analytical level at 150, you're going to miss out on a lot of stuff.
That's correct. Although some laboratories do set it that high because they know that the only samples that they analyze are single source samples, and therefore they really run no risk of issues with regard to mixtures and so forth. So they can clearly set their analytical level, analytical threshold higher and just run all day long that way.
And if you set your analytical threshold too high on a mixture, then it could affect the analysis.
It could affect the detected alleles, the reported alleles, and thus it would affect the interpretation or even the defining of the mixture.
Now, one thing you talked about at some point was being an analyst where you get to kind of use your scientific mind to really analyze what's before you. Would that be, kind of remember that part?
Yes, sir, strongly.
So there's human decisions that have to be made as part of your analysis, correct?
I would say scientific decisions. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by human decisions, but scientifically based decisions that need to be made, I believe, as you are progressing through your analysis.
So sometimes those decisions have to be assumptions you make. Would that be fair to say?
The assumptions that are made must be somehow validated. Yes, sir.
And some of the type of assumptions you can make would be the number of contributors to a sample.
Well, the number, you can make assumptions with regard to that, but really the data help determine a minimum level of the number of contributors. And then a closer look at the data will help you with regard to making an assumption that allows you to interpret the data more efficiently, if you will.
I mean, yeah, they're educated assumptions based on what you're seeing, but they're still assumptions you have to make.
Absolutely, yes, sir.
And if you make an assumption that there's too many contributors, that can make the analysis too complex for human analysis.
If you make the assumption that there are a large number of contributors, it may become more difficult to determine individual types. My mode then is to just back off and not interpret it.
which we heard on direct. At some point, you said, I'm not able to figure this one out. It's too complex.
Yes, sir.
Now, sometimes you'll assume who a major contributor is.
Yes, sir, I did that also.
And sometimes you'll assume who a minor or trace contributor is.
Yes, sir.
And you'll do that based on what you know about the case. And, as an example, this is Joseph McStay's truck, right? And he drives it every day. Let's just assume he's the major contributor.
Well, I also look to make sure that the data support that assumption.
Right, but you look at it and say, yep, looks like all his alleles are here. This seems reasonable. I'm going to assume he's the major contributor.
As long as he is, as I can justify that in the data, yes, sir.
So, like, if you went outside and sampled my truck, and you knew it was my truck, and I'm the only one that drives it, and the alleles match up to me, you're going to say, I'm assuming that's his stuff.
Yes, sir.
You're making assumptions that they're educated.
And it's also based on what is the question being asked. A lot of times, that's part of the scientific method. You remember back to like, I think it was junior high school when I first saw it, you have an observation, you have a question. And then you develop your hypotheses, then you develop your tests, you gather your data, you examine the data, and then you accept or reject the hypothesis. Always based on the question that's being asked. And so you really need to look at things based on that.
Now, one thing during direct, at some point, a chart was put up about the findings of the alleles you found in a sample for a certain item. Do you remember?
Yes, sir.
And if you decide that a major contributor is Joseph McStay and you know his profile, do you just remove all those numbers out of that chart?
In terms of the alleles,
Yes.
if he is the only major contributor, then he could be pulled out. I also need to take into account whether he shares some alleles with other potential contributors. And so that also comes into play with regard to your interpretation.
And those are known potential contributors, right? Because you know their profile.
Correct.
So if you pull out, like let's just say at some locus or location, as you were saying, Joseph McStay had an 8 and 11 at one of them. And you see 8 and 11 and 12 and 15. You say, well, I'm pulling 8 and 11 out. So we have 12 and 15. Who's that match up to? That's kind of how it's done?
At that location, yes, but really you need to take a look at the entire profile. You need to take a look at the other DNA locations to see if they also indicate really there's only these two players involved, or is there perhaps a third person? In that case, you might need to take a look at the relative fluorescent units with regard to Joseph McStay's alleles and see if perhaps something else may have also added on to those. There's a lot that goes into what's called deconvoluting a mixture, and it's very difficult to describe. It's a long and tedious process, but it is one that is required in terms of at least the thought process. It may be that it is a simple profile that is simply a major minor trace, and it's easy and it just drops out if you assume that there are 3 people present. But you need to be aware of these other possibilities. The case is not that simple.
You saw exactly where I was going. So like if you had number 8 at 1,000 RFUs and number 11 at 1,200 RFUs, you don't know if that 1,200 is all Joseph or maybe 200 should be applied to, or 11, on a minor contributor.
That's true. And so that's where the stochastic level comes in. If I have a minor contributor who is above the stochastic level, has an allele above the stochastic level, I know that that second allele was detected, if in fact it is heterozygous. If I don't see anything else but these 3 alleles, then that second allele is either, in this case, you're talking about you've got an 8, an 11, and you've got a smaller 12 that's above the stochastic level. I know that 12, if it is heterozygous, is either matched with an 11 or with an 8. And I can take a look at the RFU values that are there, determine if there are enough RFUs present to be able to match and be the second. And it may be that I can eliminate the 8, and it really can only be a 12, 11 in terms of the combination. Again, it's part of the puzzle solving, if you will, of looking at these DNA results.
When you're doing it that way, you have to know all the known subjects to know their DNA profile, so you can make those assumptions or determinations.
Actually, I can take a look at a DNA profile if it were simply a 2-person profile.
Let's say 3, because all of them in the truck are 3. So let's try 3.
If there's a possibility that you can look at it with a 3-person mixture, again, depending on the mixture. If you have proper ratio of a major, minor trace, it is possible to determine a limited number of DNA types at each DNA location for some of those samples. Again, and you can do that without making assumptions and without looking at a reference sample. So where I disagree with you is that you need a reference sample to do it. Not always. Again, it depends on the question that is being asked and what it is that you're looking for as to how you approach that.
Are you familiar with probabilistic genotyping software?
Yes, sir. I'm familiar with the term. I was on a board of directors for a short amount of time with a nonprofit organization that was developing what do they call it, a free, something where you can get it free online.
Free source.
Okay, thank you. And they talked about probabilistic genotyping, which in essence allows you to give a different frequency statistic or a different statistic related to your data. The statistic I was given was what's called a random man type of statistic, where you can just at random, what's the chance I can at random pick somebody that also would be included? Probabilistic genotyping is multifaceted in that it takes a look at your data, and some programs have the ability to change the analytical threshold and have more alleles called than were originally called at the working laboratory. They also develop a potential for what's called allele drop-in and allele drop-out. And they use all of this to develop a ratio of probabilities. And this ratio of probabilities is saying what is the probability that I'm going to get this evidence result given that so-and-so is present. On the bottom side is what is the likelihood I'm going to get this result given that so-and-so is not present. Exclusion. In essence, what you do is it goes back to the scientific method in which you have set up your hypotheses. When you set up your hypotheses, you always set up a hypothesis pair. Some of the two hypotheses pair contains all of the possibilities, but they're mutually exclusive. What the probabilistic genotyping software does is it gives you a ratio of the likelihood of one scenario versus the probability of the second scenario. It's called this likelihood ratio.
And San Bernardino Crime Lab actually purchased and uses one of those software tools, correct?
They have since I retired. Yes, sir.
I believe it was in 2017 when they started using it.
I couldn't tell you.
You know which one it is?
I believe it's called Starbase.
StarMix?
StarMix. Well, I believe it's called StarMix. I have not used it. I do believe it was developed by an analyst in Australia.
New Zealand.
Next door.
Yep.
Okay. But that's, I've just now demonstrated the extent of my knowledge.
And just for the record, for spelling, capital S, capital T, capital R, lowercase m-I-x, all one word. And Your Honor, I think that's a good place to stop.
All right, I indicated to council I need to leave a little bit early today, so we're gonna break a little bit early today. We'll be back at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Keep in mind, the admonitions previously given to you, not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case. Again, that means not discussing about the case, any of the witnesses' testimony, exhibits, parties, or attorneys. And we'll see everyone back at 9:30 tomorrow morning.